very much for inviting me back to the University of Victoria. I know I have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to well, I can't help actually by admitting to a couple of temporary ailments that I have, just in case they become visible as I am speaking. At the moment they are hidden, but so one of them is that whenever I suffer from jet lag, my language becomes pretty garbled, and so that's one real possibility that I may not be able to express myself as coherently as I would like to. Second, I've got a dry cough, and it sometimes, when it breaks out, it doesn't stop. And the third, which has happened only a couple, just yesterday, is that as I was exercising, I developed cramps, and they keep coming. And so if I bang myself hard, don't think that I'm suffering from a heart attack. It's just that I'm trying to kill my cramp. Okay, my 20 minutes begin now.
1 minute ago.
Right. So, yesterday, Jeremy spoke very fruitfully and convincingly about diversity in the way religion is conceived as individual faith, as a legal order, as a political order, as an argumentative tradition. And I think, although I don't fully recall that, but I can't help being reminded of Clifford Geertz, also religion as a cultural system, right? Now, I'll return to this. I mean, that's really digging deep into our conceptions of what it is to have a religion, or what it is to be religious. But I'm going to go a little shallower and speak of another dimension of diversity, which actually takes two forms. One is diversity of religion. So in any society, you may have people who adhere to Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, and so on. And you would call that society not homogeneous, but heterogeneous or diverse. That's one kind of diversity. The other kind of diversity is not diversity of religions, but diversity in or within religions. And that is an inevitable product of the fact that the core beliefs and practices of any religion are always interpreted in many different ways. And over a period of time, there develop groups around them, or subgroups around them, which see themselves in some ways as distinct, but not completely out of the religious, the same religious order. So you have, this, it may not be fully true, but you have, Catholics and Protestants, or Shias and Sunnis. I say that this may or may not be true because very often they see themselves as distinct religions. And you have Shaivites and Vaishnavites and so on. But that is obviously quite a different kind of diversity than the first that I mentioned. And when I speak of, and actually it was a mistake to say in the title, to use the word we, I really mean the state, and I don't pretend that I am or we are in any way the state. We're pretty much outside the state, as we all know. So when the question when we raise the question, how should states deal with religious diversity, we're really asking two different questions. One, how should states deal with diversity of religions? And how should states deal with diversity within religion? But there is, before we begin to answer the question, there is another, we need to challenge or question sometimes the presumed equality among groups and subgroups, which is implicit within the standard frame or the standard parameters of reasonable religious pluralism. Right? Whenever we talk about religious pluralism and reasonable pluralism, somehow we assume that equality between groups and equality between subgroups is a fact. We presume that. And so the whole issue is framed in such a way that we have to somehow deal with, within this framework of equality and freedom, we have to deal with difference. Sometimes the difference which is radical, irreconcilable, incommensurable, and therefore something over which we can have reasonable disagreement, and so on. And I think that framework itself has to be questioned, because this discourse of freedom and equality, I don't think this is a very original point, but nonetheless it's worth making in many current discussions of religious diversity. That the discourse of freedom and equality is actually played out within a larger setting. And in that larger setting, there are deep asymmetries of power relations. I mean, if you stand back and examine the background, which we don't always examine, we examine the background, we'll find that there is a kind of internal ordering between these or among these groups, a kind of a structuring which is already there within these groups, such that some groups are thoughtful and others are not, and some groups have the potential or the capacity to be dominating, and other groups are far more vulnerable. And it's important to recognize this, because it makes us see that endemic to diversity, both diversity of religion and diversity within religion, endemic to both is the potential potential of domination. And so there can be two forms of domination. One is what I call inter-religious domination, when members of one religious community marginalize or exclude or degrade or humiliate or oppress members of another religious community, or at least have this capacity to do so, a very live capacity to do so. And the other, which is intra-religious domination, where members of one religious community can do all these nasty things to members of their own community. Those who have different ways of looking at those core beliefs and practices. So when we are asking the question, how do we manage religious diversity, we should really keep in mind that this is a kind of a limiting case. But very largely, we are dealing with another question, which is how should we, or how should the state, respond to inter and intra-religious domination? And it's only when you begin to frame the question in this manner that you will see that many ways of understanding what we call the response of the so-called secular state are not going to be very helpful. And which are these three? I mean, I have three sort of, in some ways, morally appropriate, though inadequate responses that I have in mind. One is what we can call, we can use an abstract term for it. I call it the one-sided exclusion model, and I'll explain what that means. Or you can call it the idealized French model, because the two are in some way synonymous, where the idea is that religion should be excluded from the affairs of the state, but the state must not exclude itself from the affairs of religion. And that's why I call it one-sided exclusion. In its mild, mostly in its milder form, relatively milder form, you find it in sometimes practiced in France, but this model has found, its way in Turkey and in the former communist states, and perhaps even in China, where the state continues to have the power to intervene and for the sake of controlling religion. It doesn't care that much about internal autonomy and freedom of religions. And it's got a certain agenda. I'm not saying it's necessarily unethical. It could be ethical. The agenda would be ethical, such as the creation of an egalitarian order of a certain kind. The French have this idea of republican citizenship, and the only way in which you can create citizens in a republic, or to have a kind of a political community with a thick purpose, the only way you can do that is when people leave their religious identities behind, before they enter the public domain, right? So that's also exclusion of religion from the public domain is absolutely crucial to the formation of a political community, the formation of a republic, and this it sounds like a pretty decent ethical idea, a certain way of living out your collective life. But nonetheless, its costs are that religious freedom suffers. Now that's one kind of response of dealing with religion, and you can see that it is more or less blind to both inter and intra-religious domination. It's blind to these because it just thinks the whole goddamn thing is suspicious. It's something which you have to, ultimately it'll be great if we got rid of it, but if it's there, let it be a purely personal affair. Let it not get into the public, and certainly not into the activities of the state. So, well, that's one way the state can respond to religious diversity by simply, not really bothering about it. And that's called a secular response by one very, very standard understanding of what secularism means, laicity. And so there is a second response, which is which we might call the mutual exclusion model of understanding separation or secularism, where both the state and religion must not interfere in each other's domain. They both have their own jurisdictions. The state must not get into the affairs of religion. Religion must not get into the affairs of the state. There should be some kind of a wall, to use a Jeffersonian metaphor, some kind of a wall of separation between the two. And in fact, it's widely believed that the whole point of doing it is to primarily benefit religion, but also to benefit the political domain. I mean, it benefits religion because it just allows people religious people to order their lives in exactly the way in which they want. That could be, as long as that religious order is not comprehensive, then to use Jeremy's language, it could even have its own, if you push it further, it can have its own legal order. It can even have its own, provided it's limited and not comprehensive. That's important. It could even have its own little political order, in the sense that in some cases it could be self-governing, and it could have its own deliberative bodies, as it does. The sixth Gurdwara comes to mind. It's very often, in some ways, the leadership is elected. Oh, sorry, fine. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Okay, so that's a second. And the third model is strict neutrality, which I will not talk about. But none of these, I would say, have, I was asked to speak about the Indian way. None of these, I don't have the time to make a case for it, but none of these actually deal with both these issues properly, both aspects of domination. Neither interreligious nor intra-religious. And as a matter of fact, the Indian way, when I talk about the Indian way, I don't mean the practice of the Indian state, but I do mean the way as it was formulated in the Indian Constitution. The Indian way is that you should not have recourse to one-sided exclusion, nor should you have recourse to mutual exclusion, nor should you have strict neutrality, but you should have a policy of what we call principal distance, or what I call principal distance. And principal distance is an idea, it's a flexible, much more flexible strategy. It doesn't make fetish of any one particular way of dealing with religion or religious diversity. The idea here is that you may engage with religion or you may disengage from it. You may engage positively with religion, which is to say that you may help religion, give subsidies to religion, even recognize religious communities, officially give state recognition to them, give them rights so that they can set up their own education institutions and administer them. You can call that, some kind of a self-governance of a certain kind within a certain institutional setup. You can do all that, and the state will help you to do that. But it can also intervene negatively, so that if there are aspects of intra-religious domination, or inter-religious domination for that matter, if you find that there is one community which is acting in a reprehensible manner, violating the rights of another community, or if within a religious community there are some degrading practices that are crept in, which are to the severe disadvantage of some groups or some people, women, Dalits in India, then you've got to intervene and even ban them. So in the Indian Constitution, untouchability, for example, which is, Jeremy mentioned this, which is often seen as, which is sanctioned by on some accounts by the Hindu, some Hindu scriptures, or the ban on the entry into upper caste temples of Dalits. These are all constitutionally banned, so there is a direct intervention. I'm told that the Americans, if we were to follow the American model, that we wouldn't be able to do it. And I'm told, I'm talking to Alan Stepman, and he talked to Bruce Ackerman, who confirmed that this is something which is inconceivable in the American system. You can't just intervene in religion. You will allow religions to get rid of these problems itself, and the state will not be able to do it. And more importantly, you can intervene in one religion more than the other, because, and I won't go into any details because I have no time, the real issue is what form of strategy, which way of dealing with religion is going to reduce, minimize intra and inter-religious domination. How are we going to undermine it? And for that, you can adopt any of these strategies. You can exclude, you can disengage, or you can engage positively, negatively, and so on and so forth. So that is the constitutional Indian way. I would have loved to speak for another 5 minutes. My voice is holding up, and I wanted to, but I'm going to take half a minute and then stop. Okay. I wanted to say that I think it's time also to think in the long run and to remember that the way we conceive religious diversity is premised upon a certain conception of religion. I don't know whether Jeremy touched on this or not, but a certain conception of religion that really began to grow in the 15th, 16th century Europe, and which was perfected by the 19th century, where two things are important. One is exclusive belonging, and the other is to see religion as a system of ideas and doctrines, and therefore, very often as dogma, and to believe that this is true and everything else is false. Now, one might say that historically there is something of this nature. The Osman calls it the Mosaic distinction, which is actually, present in the Hebrew tradition and so on. But I think that the impetus to this really came, even though there were various kind of ways in which this was practiced and exercised early on. The impetus to this really came after the 15th, 16th century with the formation of exclusive religious communities. And I think this whole framework of conceiving religion is very important. We should question it and question the idea of religious diversity and look for other ways of thinking of religion. And I think although this is paradoxical, because although in Europe and in the West, very often this struggle against this conception of religion is seen as a struggle by secularists against religion. But you can quite clearly see it as within an alternative framework, as a fight between two different conceptions of religion. And I think it's high time that we talk more explicitly and openly about it, and not to see purely the struggle as between religious and secular, but to see it as between two different conceptions of religion. So the de-churching which is going on in Europe and the fight against dogma, which is so much a part of European secularism, should also be seen not simply as a part of the struggle of the secular, but as a struggle for an alternative conception of religion, and to think of diversity within that conception, and then to start thinking about how different political states have to respond to that, because that would be a very major intellectual and a political challenge and a political project for the future. Stop.
Okay. Thank you very much.